On February 18, 2001, Ken Schrader climbed out of a wrecked race car at Daytona International Speedway and ran toward another one. He was not hurt. The driver inside the black number 3 Chevrolet was his closest friend in racing, and Schrader reached that window before anyone else on the track did. For 25 years he said almost nothing publicly about what he saw in those seconds. He gave interviews. He sat for documentaries. He talked at length about everything except that. Then, in 2026, as NASCAR marked the quarter-century anniversary of that afternoon, Ken Schrader, now 71 years old, finally sat down and talked about it more openly than he ever had before. This is the story of that day, the friendship that came before it, and the 25 years of silence that followed. The 2001 Daytona 500 was NASCAR's season opener and its biggest stage. Dale Earnhardt, 7-time Cup Series champion, team owner, and the sport's most famous competitor, was running third on the final lap, behind 2 cars he owned, Michael Waltrip's and his own son's, Dale Earnhardt Jr.'s. Waltrip, in over 460 career starts, had never won a Cup race. This looked like it might finally be his day. Behind Earnhardt, a pack of cars was fighting for position that would not change who won the race, but would end up changing everything else. Ken Schrader was among them, running a strong day. He had led 7 laps and spent much of the afternoon in the top 5, according to a front-stretch interview Schrader gave 25 years after the crash. Tired of being boxed in behind the leaders, Schrader moved to the outside line heading into the final turns. As he explained it later, the group had tried the inside line against Earnhardt many times before and knew it rarely worked, so Schrader chose to run high instead. Coming off the second turn, Earnhardt made contact with Sterling Marlin's car, and his Chevrolet shot up the banking toward the wall, directly into Schrader's path on the outside line. Both cars hit the concrete barrier. On television, it did not look catastrophic. NASCAR had seen far more violent rolling wrecks walk away unhurt in years past, and the broadcast lingered on Waltrip's celebration in victory lane rather than the wreck unfolding behind it. Schrader climbed out of his own car uninjured and went straight to Earnhardt's. According to a CBC News report published shortly after the crash, Schrader looked into the number 3 car and immediately understood the severity of the situation, well before medical staff arrived to confirm anything. He did not try to pull Earnhardt from the wreckage. Instead, he turned and waved urgently for the medical crew to hurry. Earnhardt was pronounced dead a short time later at Halifax Medical Center. The official cause, per the medical examiner's report cited on Wikipedia's entry on the crash, was a basilar skull fracture, an injury determined to have been fatal instantly. While rescue workers surrounded the number 3 car, the broadcast stayed on victory lane, where Waltrip was celebrating the biggest win of his career and Earnhardt Jr. had finished second, both driving cars owned by the man now trapped in the wreckage behind them. Schrader did not go to the media pen. He went looking for Waltrip. As Schrader later told NASCAR.com for a 2026 retrospective piece, he found his friend still in the middle of the celebration and pulled him aside, away from the cameras. He didn't say the final word out loud. He told Waltrip only to be ready for it, in Schrader's words, to prepare for the worst without hearing it confirmed. Waltrip finished his winner's interview with no idea how quickly the day was about to change. NASCAR President Mike Helton delivered the official announcement to the media that evening. Earnhardt's death led front pages of newspapers that had never covered auto racing before, and his photograph appeared on the cover of Time magazine within days. 4 years afterward, Schrader answered questions about the crash by talking around its center. Reporters tried repeatedly to get him to describe what he saw through that window. He routinely steered the conversation back to the racing itself, the stats, the finish, anything but that moment. A 2020 NASCAR.com piece about an appearance on Dale Earnhardt Jr.'s Dale Jr. Download podcast noted that, nearly 2 decades after the crash, Schrader still had not spoken a public word about what he saw. To understand why that silence lasted so long, it helps to understand what Schrader and Earnhardt actually were to each other, which, by most accounts, was closer to family than to fellow competitors. Their friendship produced a string of stories that Schrader has told and retold over the years, most recently in interviews tied to NASCAR's 25th anniversary coverage and on the Ken Schrader podcast with fellow former driver Kenny Wallace. Before Schrader finished building a pond on his North Carolina property, Earnhardt rode out to see the site and told him exactly how to build it, where to dig, where to place the dam, and promised to supply the fish once it was done. When the pond was finished and Schrader called to collect, the fish did arrive. They arrived cash on delivery. Schrader still brings up the story, according to NASCAR.com, as proof that even Earnhardt's generosity came with a catch. In a story Schrader told on the Ken Schrader podcast, as reported by Whiskey Riff, Earnhardt once offered to take him out for seafood when a burger joint near their shops was too crowded. Seafood turned out to mean a convenience store trip for crackers and sardines. It was, in Schrader's telling, a small window into how country Earnhardt stayed even after he'd become one of the wealthiest men in motorsports. At a car show in Detroit, the two men both fell for the same impractical purchase, an amphicar, a novelty vehicle built to drive on roads and float on water. They got as far as the parking lot before turning back to buy it. Earnhardt put down cash on the spot. Schrader had his own shop wire a cashier's check and send a truck to collect it. According to NASCAR.com, the story almost had a sequel. Former NASCAR President Bill France Jr. and a longtime NASCAR official owned a second amphicar, and there was loose talk of staging a race between the two vehicles on the lake inside the Daytona infield. It never happened. The friendship extended to their families. When Schrader's then 10-year-old daughter joined the Earnhardts on an extended family trip aboard their yacht, she grew homesick. It was Earnhardt, not her own father, who pulled her onto his lap and talked her through it until she settled down. Schrader has said she never forgot it. These are small stories. That is, in a sense, the point. They are the kind of details that survive only between people who genuinely liked each other long after the trophies and point standings stopped mattering. For much of the last 25 years, one explanation for Earnhardt's final laps hardened into something close to accepted fact, that Earnhardt was running defense on the final lap, holding back the field so his son and his lead driver could cruise to a 1-2 finish unbothered. It's a tidy story. It fits the sentimental narrative many wanted to tell about his death. According to Schrader, it isn't quite right. In the same 2026 NASCAR.com interview, Schrader was direct about it. Waltrip and Earnhardt Jr., he said, did not need protecting that day. Their cars were simply faster, and the finish for first and second was already decided. Earnhardt wasn't blocking out of generosity toward his son or his driver, in Schrader's account. He was blocking to finish as high as he possibly could himself. A 1-2-3 sweep would have been good for Dale Earnhardt Incorporated, the team Earnhardt owned, but Schrader's read was that Earnhardt simply wanted to finish first. Full stop. That distinction matters. It reframes Earnhardt's final laps away from a story of noble sacrifice and towards something more familiar to anyone who watched him race for 2 decades. A man competing exactly the way he always had, right up until the last corner he ever drove. Schrader was there for the decision that put him on the outside line, the same line that left him with nowhere to go when Earnhardt's car came up the banking. He has described that choice plainly, without any added drama. The group had tried the inside line against Earnhardt too many times before, and it never worked. Going outside wasn't a gamble. It was a lesson learned from years of racing against the same driver, a lesson that, on this particular lap, put Schrader closest to the wall when everything went wrong. The weeks that followed turned into one of the most intense periods of change in American racing history. Investigators examined the construction of the concrete wall, the design of the car, and Earnhardt's safety equipment. Per NASCAR's own findings and reporting from the time, Earnhardt had reportedly resisted newer head and neck restraint devices, a stance shared by a number of drivers in that era, who often treated in-car discomfort as an acceptable trade for feel and control behind the wheel. NASCAR's subsequent investigation, which ran past 500 pages, examined the physics of the crash in detail and led directly to a wave of safety reforms across the sport within a few years. Energy-absorbing safer barriers installed at major tracks, a redesigned Car of Tomorrow chassis, and mandatory head and neck restraint devices for every driver. Schrader kept racing through all of it, through the introduction of the very safety systems his own crash helped force into existence, carrying a memory that none of his rivals shared with him. In 2026, as the sport marked the 25th anniversary of Earnhardt's death, NASCAR and Fox Sports aired a documentary, We've Lost Dale Earnhardt. 25 years later, built around rare footage and first-hand accounts from that day, including from former NASCAR president Mike Helton, who had delivered the original announcement to the press in 2001. Around that same anniversary, Schrader gave one of the most extensive interviews of his life to NASCAR.com and to Front Stretch, revisiting his career, the crash, and the friendship in more detail than he had offered in a quarter-century. Even then, he stopped short of describing, in graphic terms, exactly what he saw through that window. What he offered instead was everything around it: the decision to warn Waltrip before anyone else could, his disagreement with the popular blocking narrative, and the small, specific, unglamorous details of a friendship, a pond, a stubborn fish delivery, a novelty car neither man could resist. Dale Earnhardt Jr., for his part, has spoken publicly and emotionally about what Schrader has carried on his behalf. In a widely shared 2020 appearance on the Dale Jr. Download podcast, Earnhardt Jr. read a note he had written to Schrader, calling him a keeper of that delicate information, and telling him he was glad it had been Schrader who was there, rather than anyone else. That may be the real shape of Schrader's long silence. It was never about protecting a secret so shocking it couldn't be spoken. It was about protecting a friend's family and legacy from having its most painful moment reduced to a single sentence on a highlight reel, and choosing instead to let a friendship, told through its smallest and warmest details, speak for the man. Dale Earnhardt's legacy still shapes NASCAR today, referenced by drivers who never shared a garage with him and grew up only watching his highlights. But the fullest portrait of who he actually was doesn't come from a highlight reel or a magazine cover. It comes from the one man who stood closest to him at the very end, who bought a ridiculous amphibious car with him, argued with him over a fish delivery, and spent 25 years quietly deciding how much of that final moment the world actually needed.